Welcome in to another episode of the TheatreQs podcast. Today's episode is absolutely amazing. But before we get into the interview, let's hear a theater fun fact. Today's show is all about set design, so for today's fun fact, I decided to ask for the help of Erik Ulfers, a 6-time Emmy-winning set designer who has designed sets for theaters across Europe, as well as sets for NBC, ABC, and many others. To share our fun fact, please welcome Erik Ulfers.
You know, it's interesting because when you ask the question of like how has the theater impacted sort of the world of TV design that I adopted, later in my career, I started in the theater. I think it comes down to like some pretty fundamental notions around, what constitutes good and effective design generally. Certainly in my mind, and this is held true through my whole career, is that in a way, form always follows content. So in the theater, you have a script, or you have a body of music composed. Whether it's, or ballet, same thing, it's music. You have to pay a lot of attention to the intent, the communication intent of the content itself. And that's where all the secrets lie in terms of how to express an environment, that will actually service that content. And I think it's true in theater, I think it's true in opera, ballet, and of course, and television, of course. I think it's really hard to parse or separate, who came first in terms of what I learned from the theater and then how that impacted TV. In theater, you do not just research in terms of the text itself. We'll just say a drama, for example. You have the benefit of the script, of course, but you also have tons of research that you have to do in terms of historical perspective and period research, on and on. And all that, of course, pulls together into that final design.
Thank you so much, Erik. Now, my guest today is an 11-time Tony-nominated set designer and 3-time Tony winner from Yuma, Arizona, best known for designing the sets of Book of Mormon, Mean Girls, Shucked, Urinetown, Something Rotten, Take Me Out, and many others. He has designed the sets for 60 Broadway shows. He's joining me today from London, where Mean Girls is opening on the West End. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Scott Pask.
How are you?
Good, I'm good. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure. Yeah. Sorry, it's taking a little bit. It's been a little crazy.
Oh, no worries.
Um,
So, you are coming
how?
to us from London. So, how are
Yes,
things in London?
absolutely. Things are good. Things are good. We're just in the thick of Mean Girls rehearsal and shop visits and getting that ready to be loaded while loading into the theater now and getting it ready for tech rehearsal. So yeah.
Nice. So, first off, for our listeners, introduce yourself and what are some of your achievements and I guess career greatest hits?
I'll start just by saying I'm Scott Pask and I'm a set designer and I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, and I graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in architecture and then went on to pursue my training in theater at the Yale School of Drama. And I've been a set designer since I received that. And some of the current shows I have running are Book of Mormon and Mean Girls here and um, plenty of some others that have come before and since.
So, yeah, you've done 60 Broadway shows, right? You've designed the sets for.
That is, yeah, it's miraculous, incredible, yeah.
So you mentioned
Started very young. I was very lucky, very young. Let's put it that way. That doesn't age me out. But yeah.
So you mentioned that you grew up in Yuma, and Yuma is not like,
Yeah.
in my eyes at least, like a theater centric community. So what was your access to theater like?
I don't really, I mean, I didn't have a ton of access, to be honest. I sort of feel like some of the windows that were important there were seeing the Tony Awards on television and when that would come around, and that was always sort of kind of a miracle in itself, just watching that from afar, not really understanding what it was all about, seeing the pageantry of the sort of broadcast and the celebration of that event, and then witnessing not only the behind the scenes performances, meaning by all the design discipline, well, the design disciplines that were celebrated then when I was a kid, and then
Hmm.
the performances on stage, and then the musicals and plays that were being celebrated, and just kind of not fully comprehending that it was a real job. I mean, I think that a lot of us kind of grew up. I mean, I was aware a little bit of the structure of just community theater, and I have friends that are still very immersed in that in many places, and I was aware of that a little bit, and in junior high was in a couple of plays, and um, but yeah, my head, I was always like I drew, and I loved art classes and things like that, and that's sort of where my affinity lied or lay, and then as I got to start to understand that it wasn't just an elaborate hobby, that some people really did have that as a career. And uh, I found that to be pretty miraculous. But I'm going to circle back for a minute. Probably the first show I saw, a Broadway show that was, I saw a touring production of The King and I in San
Cool.
Diego. And my parents had gone to see Annie in Phoenix, I think. And I remember I have a twin brother and a younger sister, and we all were kind of like obsessed with the Annie soundtrack. And then when I saw The King and I was sort of thought that was pretty remarkable. And it turns out Casey Nicholaw, the director who I'm here doing Mean Girls with, and we did Book of Mormon and The Prom and um I don't know, they go off the top of my head, Something Rotten, and that was and it turns out he lived in San Diego, and he had seen that tour go through town when he was in school as well. So
Oh, no way.
that's a funny kind of linkage. But yeah, so I saw that and thought that was pretty incredible. And when I was in college and pursuing the degree at the U of A was a 5-year bachelor's professional degree, which I loved, and I loved that education. I loved that school. I loved being in Tucson, and it was sort of during that time, still keeping the kind of like art school like ideas in my brain as I was doing the architecture. And um, I started kind of going across the street, as they say, to the art school, because the colleges were right across from each other, and I found out that because they have a great theater program, and particularly musical theater program, and I would just see some productions, and especially at Centennial Hall, some things were coming through town
Hmm.
that were these national tours that were really important to see, and it was important to me at that time, and kind of shaping my vision of what was interesting and what I wanted to kind of pursue. And um, so yeah, there was a set design course. I think it was a graduate level course though, and I feel like the curriculum was I just didn't have those prerequisites done, and in
Hmm.
order to kind of mesh that into a very rigorous education at the College of Architecture, it just took some really amazing collaboration between the College of Architecture administration and the College of Art, and which had the School of Drama there in its purview. And they allowed me to take this class, and I then assisted the head of the department who was teaching that class. And because I went over there and showed my architectural models, and they were really like very precise, and it's still something that we do in the studio for productions. And we just it was one of those, I guess, those miracles of just knowing in your gut what you wanted, like that this was a direction to pursue, and then
Hmm.
figuring out the little steps it took to kind of get there, and the support of others around who were recognized that it was important to me, and helped figure out a path, or just said, yeah, let's, he does that, and he can do those things during that time, and we'll like just that kind of navigation of credits and this and that. It was really helpful to kind of have support from both of those colleges to do that work. And then I graduated from the College of Architecture, and then I moved to New York, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. And there was no question that I was not going to have that degree in architecture. I loved that program. I loved that degree. For me, one of the most kind of beautiful professions in the world, um, and it was really important. Like shaping space for me, it's always been important, and that's why the happiest I always was with drawing houses, and
Hmm.
I that's what I did when I was young, and then kind of then thinking about the emotional content of space and how people move through space and understanding like just all the factors that are a part of the space making and immersive environments that became important to me. And a lot of them were emotional response. And I found a lot of that in theatrical productions and a very kind of considered view on the stage, and whether it's in a round or however that is, and an audience witnessing something all together at the same time and responding and understanding the ephemeral nature of theater is me like having worked with so many actors and directors over the years, knowing that never like each performance is singular, and those moments are very can be very different from night to night, and that's the thrill of it. And I think so many people will remember something and be like, oh, I remember when that happened and that spun around, or that piece of scenery fell, or that incredible line was uttered and the rain happened, or whatever. There's
Hmm.
something that kind of touches you, and I think that nostalgia and memory are such kind of powerful forces, and then kind of the mystery of that is all very exciting. So I think being a part of that um, was a thrilling, um, I guess, aspiration. And it's such a collaborative um, process, as you know. I mean, it's like there are a lot of people in the room making the work that we make, and I find that to be really thrilling. And working together for a sort of singular goal of hopefully doing something very special, and with a unifying vision by that director, choreographer, uh, writer, orchestration, choreographer. I am reiterating other point, but composer, all of that, whatever it is, there's some kind of coming together of a singular idea that may be supported by many other smaller visions within it, but that there isn't like this idea that we all want to kind of focus on to and some lens that we're focusing on a piece.
Well, I think it's one of the most important things about theater is, and I think that's sort of sometimes missed by younger actors, where they'll watch, a show at Centennial Hall, and they don't, I don't, at least I didn't, as a younger person, fully process like, oh, there are a lot of people, that who set design and, like you said, composer, choreographer, director, who all have to have the same vision and who all, you know, yeah, like you said, it's a very collaborative effort, and so I think that recognizing that is is really
Yeah.
important.
No, and then especially like sound, lighting, costume, I mean, just on and on, and makeup, hair, projections when they're a part of it. It's like there's just a lot of disciplines within each production, and we're all kind of working together to achieve a singular approach to a project, and hopefully illuminate that project in a way that is, fresh for the audience.
So you mentioned the Tonys earlier, and you have 11 Tony nominations and three Tony wins under your belt. Do you still get starstruck at the Tonys? Like, you've been to the show, all these years, but you grew up watching it. Do you have those moments like, oh man, I'm at the Tonys?
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible. Yes, the Tonys are incredible, and to have been a part of it and to have three is still kind of mind blowing. And Yeah, I mean it is huge to me, and also like overwhelming as well. Um, Starstruck, I think once you're in the room, if you're on the roster for the evening, you're more like we're all kind of sharing an amount of terror, or not terror, but like anxiety, and like the anxiety of like really wanting to win, and then the terror of like, oh my God, what will I say? Or whatever. There's just a lot going on. It's a lot. Um it's a very dense evening. I will say that. And it's nice to see like friends and the productions that we're there with, and that is wonderful. But it's more like dazzled by the just the sheer context for sure, always. It is thrilling to be a part of the theater, the just to be a part of that community is a real like gift. And that is that I hold incredibly special and incredibly dear.
So, Urinetown was your first Broadway show, and you
Hmm.
mentioned how you were, fortunate to get that job as a young set designer. So how'd you
Oh,
manage to get what was it like to get that?
well, it's funny. I'm in London, and I was just on Sunday at a lunch with the director of a project that I'm working on now. We've worked together on many over the years. Diane Paulus, who's brilliant. We did a revival of Pippin that I think we're just both so incredibly proud of, and many other productions. But we had met. Both of us were in school at different universities at the time in our pursuing our degrees in the dramatic arts, and she was assisting a director. I was assisting a designer, and we were both in the meeting that they were having for the production that they were working on. And so I was in this um, studio, and after just this summer of meeting, I was there in between years it was between my first and second year in grad school, maybe, or second and third. And we just, after a number of those meetings, we just got to know each other. And when like we were out of school, we just stayed in touch, and we would do these kind of, I mean, they're amazing, like projects that they were all like Diane was such a kind of intrepid, and remains the same because she runs ART, the American Repertory Theater in Cambridge at
Oh, really?
Harvard. And we did some shows off Broadway, and we one of the ones that we did was A Midsummer Night's Dream, but it was retold in a disco with disco songs, and it was called The Donkey Show. And it was in a small shop down in the Lower East Side called the Piano Store, and then it transferred to a nightclub for various evenings during the week, and it ran for a really long time, and it is this kind of like underground weekend event, and then I think it was Wednesday or Thursdays, Friday, Saturday, or something like that. But it was such fun, and it just this immersive disco thing that was retelling of Shakespeare, and in that context, it was just really fun, and the story and the narrative and the thread were incredibly clear, and it was told through disco. And we did that show when she took over when she became the head of ART. We There was a performance space there, a smaller theater, and we turned that into a sort of a club, and I helped design the interior of that, and we made that into sort of much more malleable performance space, like an experimental space. And the Donkey Show ran there for a good 10 years, and I think it just
Wow.
stopped maybe 2 years ago. So it's been this kind of great thread through our lives. And I got a call from a producer who was looking to have like to make an off-Broadway production of Urinetown. And so I said absolutely, let's. I met with them, and I saw the space where they wanted to do it, and it was super exciting. And so I jumped on board, and we did that space and transformed a theater on 54th Street, which was upstairs from a police station, which was kind of amazing. And just the external architecture. And if anyone knows that musical, it just was such a kind of strong narrative to kind of go through this building that was to the side of um, this police station, and then go upstairs into this place where it was all about kind of surveillance and the police state that was cracking down on public um, relieving, I guess, where you had to do that. It was taxed, and you had to pay for it, and to do it. And so that was my so that happened and it got like rapturous reviews, and then it was set to transfer to Broadway. And so we were working on that, and our opening night was set for September 12th, 2001. And towers fell on September 11th, obviously. And so I think we were all just in a state of just total shock and despair. But the people of New York were really encouraged by everyone to just kind of go out and support your local grocer, support the shops, support restaurants, support the arts, support like just be very like don't react in fear, react in support for your like everybody, your fellow citizens and of this town, that in this city and this country that had just been so assaulted. Um and we continued on. Broadway kept going, and it like everybody kind of took the just caught our breaths for a moment, and then the show did open. We opened to great reviews on Broadway, and I want to say I can't quite I think it was I want to say September 21st, but I have to double check that fact. Um, but I remember going back to the very first opening post that horrific event was a production of, oh my gosh, it was with Patti LuPone, and it's an onstage backstage play. Oh my God, it's totally escaping me. But I remember it was just such an important evening where everybody was just kind of coming together in shock, but in support of the arts, and to keep everything alive, I guess, was the sort of important feeling that we all had amidst this incredible tragedy, and all of us were touched by that. And some was new people, and some like it was just a really horrible time. And anyway, that was the context for my first Broadway show.
Yeah, well, my my aunt, who's an author, was living in New York at the time, and told me that that was the case. That, like, common courtesy blossomed, amidst this tragedy in a city that's, usually overrun by bikers yelling at taxi cab drivers, and.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh my God, there was just such. I think it just was, yeah, an immediate affection for each other and care. I guess that's the best word, care, and just because I think everyone felt like if we were still there, we were survivors of this horrifying like act of violence, and this atrocity. Yeah, I mean it did band us all together, and there was this kind of just amazing sense of community. Yeah.
So, as far as, because you mentioned that Urinetown ran off Broadway and was very successful, what are the differences? Like, what changes do you have to make from an off Broadway to a Broadway show, and then from Broadway to touring?
Off Broadway to Broadway, I think that really depends on where the show, what the theater and what the context is off Broadway. In the case of Urinetown, I kind of taken out a sort of decrepit proscenium and created a catwalk that went around the whole space. And the catwalk is still in the space today because the theater owners were just ecstatic about having it. And it unified the space, and it made it a much more malleable environment for theater making. And it was and it kind of I created a deck and then a little deck extension, and then everything else was kind of done with a few elements, but it was really kind of creating an environment that was evocative of the for the show. And I think I painted the whole thing in gloss black, and then it was aged to have like water stains all over, and everything was rusted, and then there was a gleaming side of the wall for the UGC and all white porcelain, and then the decayed side for the public bathroom. And but that was then became that went into a big proscenium house, and well, I mean a modest scale proscenium house, the Henry Miller at the time, and now it's the Sondheim. And it became about taking this kind of immersive space where the audience was almost surrounded by the catwalks, and then to a proscenium space saying, how can we create that environment? So
Hmm.
the catwalk was main, there was a wall kind of brought forward that was reminiscent of the wall that we had in the theater there, that had these kind of great windows in, and they were the actual architecture of the room, and I'd stack them with fluorescent tubes and for lighting, and then the catwalk did kind of just come out into the boxes, and that idea of surveillance was important. So that was kind of very present within the theater, and people in the mezzanine could really see lock, stock, and barrel, these two characters from the police that were moving around, and it was a great way to kind of have that idea flourish in a larger context, and but still maintain the intimacy and all the things that were really great about it. I always feel like it's key. It's a very delicate balance, like holding that kind of water as you hold it up the hill to make sure you don't lose the sort of essence of what was making it successful in its prior incarnation, and then expanding it so that it can successfully include the number of people that will be in that sort of larger venue. And then for touring, I find that, I mean, very often it's like there are a lot of very tough parameters, parameters of time and parameters of space and number of trucks and things like that become very real design shapers, actually. So it really, like, trying to, again, like, maintain the essence of what the show is in a way that can exist on, when I say on the road, like in that sort of, in that way. Sometimes the tourists will sit down in a state or a city for 4 weeks or even longer. And sometimes they're very fast. Sometimes it's a week and sometimes even split weeks. So it's just being nimble with the design and making sure the essence of what it is there, and that it is recognizable. It's a Broadway show that's touring, that it has the essence, so that it is for sure, so that it's very, like, very referential to the Broadway production, so that there is that lineage and that link. I'm in the midst of doing Some Like It Hot and Shocked for national tours now, and enjoying that process of transforming what we've done on those Broadway stages for the touring venues has been fun.
Do you have a process for designing sets? Like, is there a certain way that you map them out every time, or does it depend on the show?
Definitely depends on the show, and I think it always starts with a read and a conversation, and depending on what the project is, whether it's an opera or a musical or a Shakespeare or a play that I'm doing a revival of, I think or a new play, which is, I think, one of my favorite things. I love a new play, and I am always very excited about that. But yeah, it's like I'm doing a play at Steppenwolf, and when I leave here in June, by Sam Hunter, who's brilliant and who wrote The Whale, and I'm doing that directed by Joe Mantello, who I've been very lucky to work with a lot, and with Laurie Metcalf. And when we were on Broadway, we were doing a production of a revival of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf when the pandemic came, and we had 9 performances, and then Broadway closed, and then ours, we never reopened. We just, with too many obstacles and too much time passed, and it was just one of the sort of casualties of that time, and it will always be a sort of bittersweet, um, yeah, bittersweet thing. A great thing for the moment that we had it, and then sad that it's almost a piece of, like, Broadway lore legend at this point, because it was something we were all really proud of. But so I love new plays, and I'm very happy and excited to work with Sam on this new play in um, Chicago very soon, called Little Bear Ridge Road. And then yeah, so I think it really depends on, I mean, if it's a revival, it's like, I think it's important to be looking at, like, what's the lens through which we're viewing that material in a different way today, because when it was written, there was the context of even just daily life was different, no matter how recent or how long ago. And so I always feel like that's very important, and to keep and that I'm supporting the vision of the team, that we're all kind of on the same page. But I usually will start reading and then note, like, just notes in the margins or notes on my notebook, and then I start drawing very small, almost like postage stamp size um pieces of yeah, little sketches in the margins sometimes on a script. And I mean, I was in Mean Girls today, like reorder. There was a sequence that we're playing around with, so I just kind of was just writing through it, and that was more just text based, and then doing little scribbles. But usually, if I'm reading or doing a script, it's like I'm really kind of doing these very tiny sketches, and sometimes they're on my Instagram post. I'll put them in on like on that. And then I'll kind of blow them up a little bit. And then I kind of end up storyboarding at about 8.5 by 11. And I draw in pencil. And then it will go to model. And sometimes the model is how it works. It depends on who I'm working with and what the methods in which they like to work. But I usually will sketch because I like sketching, and it's also a very fast way of getting some ideas down on paper, and just even into the sort of atmosphere for me to kind of say, okay, there's a version that I'm thinking of, and let me think about that other idea, and let me put them down, and then see what the responses are. But usually for me, it does start with some drawings, and yeah, and then versions, because I like to explore various ideas, and then sometimes I'll be researching something specific for it, and something will come out of that reference.
So as far as you talked about how new plays are your favorites, but as far as revivals go, I've talked about this a similar idea to this with some of the actors who I've had on. How do you differentiate your set from the original set of that
I
show?
should preface it by saying new plays and new musicals. I mean, new work in general, I think. It's like I love the first time that it's getting a three-dimensional. I love being a participant in that process when something's being like kind of born to the first time. Like a new work in general, I think is really thrilling. Um, remind me the question again, because I totally just went off track.
How do you differentiate your sets from, like, for revivals, your sets from the original
Oh,
set?
like in a revival, in a revival.
Yeah.
How do we? I sort of feel I'm just thinking back of a couple. I mean, Hair was so different from the original, and the original was so iconic. But the context for what we did on Hair was we started in the Delacorte at the Public Theater's, the New York Shakespeare Festival's space in Central Park, and so it all started by kind of recreating a very authentic park-like atmosphere there. Actually, I brought grass down to the stage, and I kind of finished a wall so it looked like the original theater that was built in the 60s, and then planted trees behind that wall. So it was almost like having a park encroach on the space and to create that sort of intimacy and community. And so when we moved that to um, the El Hirschfeld, everybody was like, the big question was like, how we do that? The park was such a big character of it. And I said, I think the energy of the cast, once we're kind of now in an architectural space, the containment of that is something that will be really thrilling. So I just almost treated it as though that company of actors had just jumped on in a truck and moved everything down, like what they had, and took over the theater, painted a mural on the wall. And the audience doesn't know, but there was a whole wall that was built up again, like upstage, to kind of create a more intimate background. And then the floor was raked, so I could like kind of push the energy or usher the energy into the theater a bit more. And then it was covered with like a ton of these beautiful Moroccan carpets and things, and just the texture and colors of that, and that worked beautifully with the costumes. And then the lighting of that Kevin Adams did was such a sort of magical part of it, and then being able to kind of immerse the sort of theater space in that spirit. I mean, and I think it's certainly different for plays and musicals. And like Pippin, I think was so different from the original because our approach to that, which again directed by Diane Paulus, we were thinking about that as almost like a moving. It's sort of conceived as a kind of moving theater piece, but we were obsessed with the idea of circus and um, the idea of incorporating like circus acts within Pippin itself, within the structure of that, and using them as a narrative um, force within that, which was thrilling. And that was an incredible directorial approach and such a fun project. I'm still like just such a fan of that process and that production. I loved that. And but I think that it's just really approaching it with the team and the director and um trying to see how you're illuminating um that piece, that work. I mean, American Buffalo, I gratefully got to do that in a context in which it hadn't been really performed in New York, or to my knowledge, and doing it in a Circle in the Square with Neil Pepe, brilliant director, and we did that with Lawrence Fishburne, Sam Rockwell, and Darren Criss, and we did that in a theater that is largely a thrust, but almost in the round, and I almost made it more in the round and added seats to kind of contain the space even more and tighten it all up so that you really were sharing the room with them. And I think that like that proximity and that intimacy was so special for that play, and you really felt the kind of that you were part of the room. And I think that that was very special for that play and that production, which was from, I'd have to look at the year, but many years ago. Um, and I'm doing another project in a similar fact, like a play that like through a lens of what's the lens today, or what's the lens, what's even like the lens of the space, if we're being true to the period in which the play is written, or if it's some of it is important that if cell phones weren't a part of that context, it's like depends on what the approach is. Are we thinking about technology? Like is that impacting what we're doing on the play or musical? And that becomes a very directorial approach and conversation. So it can be a lot of different factors that influence how different it is, and the launch pad for our singular like vision for that.
So every episode of the podcast, I like to play a little bit of a game with the guests. So I have got um, a game for you that I'm going to call On the Spot Set. So in this game, I'll tell you a wacky made up production plot, and you'll have 15 seconds to describe how you would build a set for that show.
Okay.
All right. So, ready?
Nope. Got me a pencil here just so I can jot it down, my thoughts. Okay.
So, the first one is a historical air and space museum discovers that their planes fly around at night. Three, two,
Okay.
one.
Say that one more time again. Say that. Give me one more. A
His-
historical.
a historical air and space museum discovers that their planes fly around at night.
Well, I mean, I don't even do that's sort of, I think, starting to think of it's grounded in the reality of a real space. And then how does the wall, how does it become, how do the boundaries of that space, like, how do they go away? And then that kind of creates a whole new world and a new terrain. So to me, it would start with, I'd probably comb through a bunch of museums and things and find something that's inspiring as far as like the architecture, or dream it up, or like, I don't know. Yeah, but it's definitely about starting with something that becomes completely magical and transformable.
Next up is a studio for filming jazzercise commercials turns out to have an incredible alarm system.
Oh my gosh. Um, I don't know. Let's do that one in the round so that so we're not reliant upon the context of the room. But I see a lot of mirrors somehow, and maybe the mirrors are actually around the audience. And I think that the lights and the sonic environment are a big part of the world. And however we're creating scale, that we want to feel the intimacy of that space and then be able to explore beyond that. But I think that would be something that might be fun to do in a malleable space and not a traditional proscenium, and then keep it in an intimate scale.
And next up is a band conductor gets so involved in the performance that he becomes stuck in the sheet music.
Oh, okay. That one I want to go back to workshop the idea because I think we should look at what the real arc of that story is. Stuck in the sheet music, and then the sheet music becomes like what is he in the midst of conducting? Because I think that is the kind of key to what the next part of this is, and whether this is a musical or a play is another big question. But I think that what's on his stand is a kind of key to how I would probably move forward in thinking about that. But I love the idea of even just playing around with the context of the orchestra pit or the onstage orchestra. I mean, I have dreams of like right now when it's like very actually last like Carnegie Hall, like for example, where they're very much elevated and the focus of that room. That would be a fun one to kind of start with, where it's all out there for for the public consumption. Every sort of missed step or um, page fallen.
And then finally is students hide out in a school cafeteria during an apocalypse started by Regina George.
Oh my gosh, I feel like we're in that right now. Not the apocalypse though, actually, but I like the cafeteria. We just were doing the cafeteria scene when I when I left the room today. Um, I think we could stage that on the stage that I'm doing right now. That would be fun. Absolutely. Yeah, we could do that, rehearse that scene at the Savoy Theatre here in London next week.
Yeah, just
But
submit
yeah,
submit a few changes to the script and there you go.
absolutely. Absolutely. No, that sounds fun.
So thank you for playing along with me.
Oh gosh, my pleasure. That was funny and very fun. That you conjure those is amazing.
So to finish off the episode, every actor or I guess you're the first set designer, so every person on the podcast, I like to ask the same three questions, and they're more trivial,
Okay.
just to sort of you know get for the audience to get to know the person. So I call
Yeah, is this the
this
lightning round?
sure. I call these the theater threes. So
Okay.
the first one is, what is your favorite musical?
Oh wow, that's a tough one. I oh gosh, I have such a strong affinity for Pippin. I think um I do think Sweeney Todd is a flawless music. I mean, I think the story, the book, the music, the lyric. I mean, I just think that's an incredible musical, and just something I just never tire of that. But I was obsessed with Les Mis when I was a kid. So I mean, I love. I mean, but I would have to say I think Sweeney Todd is just such a like an incredible piece of theater.
Yeah, definitely. The U of A just did Sweeney Todd, and I regret not seeing it. I really wanted to see it.
They did it when I was there. I mean, it's always done because it's such an incredible show. I mean, the current Broadway revival is really great, and I saw it the first time on with Angela Lansbury on PBS, I think, watching it and just kind of going like, "Oh my gosh, this is unbelievable," because it was just sort of very like it just spoke so wonderfully of the period. And even then, I was kind of going, "Oh my God, this whole factory aesthetic is amazing," and it spoke to the context of London when it was taking place, and it was just such a sort of rich tapestry of those textures and a riot of like people and the whole story was just, I loved it so much. I just thought that was such an incredible production.
The second question is, what actor did you look up to, or actor, I guess, anybody in the arts industry did you look up to as a kid, and why?
Oh gosh, wow. Funny. I mean, I've had a lot of design heroes and they earned so many different disciplines and artists and designers. So that's a tricky one. I mean, yeah, I want to like think about that more. I'm this is kind of sort of out of context, but like I'm a huge fan of like the Italian Baroque architects, which I only learned because I studied them in college and it was a formative experience for me. But they really played around with emotion and plasticity within architectural space, and like talking about the piazza out front of St. Peter's, how the ellipse, the colonnade, you can be walking down that colonnade and you don't know where don't see the end of it or the terminus of that space. And then when you reach the end of it, you're presented with the facade of St. Peter's at its most impressive, kind of what as this intended view. And I just thought that was such an incredible, and there's so many incredible cathedrals there that or even smaller churches. I mean, so that's a huge one. So like I would just say like Bernini and Borromini are huge. I'm a huge fan of them. So that's like a completely weird answer. Um, Art wise, I'm a huge fan of Mark Rothko. So that's a massive one. And then in theater, gosh, I am going to say, I mean, I just saw that I'm going to say something that's a little bit old, but like the Zeffirelli production of Turandot at the Met is one of the most jaw-dropping spectacles. You can't even believe it. And like to try it's that I think is a jaw dropper. Like just incredible. And it makes my sound like my personal tastes are so sort of like I don't know, crazy because I'm very like in my personal life, it's all the spaces in which I inhabit and create for myself are very kind of material based, and I would say like austere, but I mean austere in a sort of warm way. Like the house in the desert is adobe and glass and brick and all these incredible surfaces. So I don't have a highly decorated personal universe, but but then I admire designers like Bob Crowley, who's a great friend. I admire him very, very much. And the carousel that he did years ago was so kind of boundary pushing. And Richard Hudson is someone who I just had the benefit of seeing not long ago in New York, and his work is so incredible. And he designed The Lion King, but it was very like had done incredible things before that. And yeah, there's all disciplines that I'm kind of like flailing right now. So maybe let's go to the other question. I'll think of something else on the way around.
And the third and final question of the Theater Threes is, what advice do you have for theater kids or anyone wanting to get into the industry?
I This is sort of like so age old and not that insightful, but I think it is like follow your instincts and then trust them. And I think that's really important because and also do what you like. If you enjoy it, then that's something you should really make important and understand what it is that you love about it and how do you parlay that into something that is something that you can do every day, because if you love it and you enjoy it and you get great joy from it and support from people around you to pursue that, I think that's really important. But I think having the instincts to kind of love that and find what gives you that sort of immense gratification and happiness, that's worth pursuing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule and your Regina George apocalypse to visit with me.
Okay, we have a song called World Burn, so it just makes me laugh because there is the internal apocalypse in the musical that we're doing right now. It happens within the hallway when the burn book goes viral. But yeah, no, thank you, Nate, so much. It's been really nice speaking with you.
It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Scott. It was an absolute pleasure. I'd like to give a shout out to Lance, a listener whose question inspired me to ask Scott about Urinetown. Thank you for listening, Lance. To everyone else, 2 of Scott's productions are starting their national tour soon, so go see Shucked and Some Like It Hot when they come to your city. You can follow Scott at Scott Pask Studio on Instagram. Thank you all so much for listening today. TheatreQs is produced by Nate Wiley Productions and me, Nathaniel Wiley, featuring music by Joyheads. Joyheads is a Pasadena-based music group composed of Juan Gomez, Daniel Johnson, and Jeremy King. The song that you heard in this episode is A Real Good Time. If you like what you hear on the podcast, follow the podcast and check out our website, natewileyproductions.com, for a wide variety of content, from historical series to photo galleries and much, much more.